In today's tutorial, we are going to be doing some sound design, but before we can start sound designing, we need something to actually sound design. If you're interested in following along with this exact project, it'll be available on my Patreon at patreon.com/Mapal, or just go to the link in the description where it will be linked as well. We'll also have monthly live streams, and you can get in direct contact with me and the other people in the Patreon as well. So hopefully it'll be super fun, kind of like a community. But without further ado, let's hop straight into the tutorial and start animating. So in After Effects, I have a 1920 composition set up at 24 frames per second. The first thing we'll do is we will take our little shape layer up here, and we will make a rectangle, and we'll change the fill to a gradient fill. And you want to make sure that the fill is set to just a 2-color fill, where one is black and the other is white. You can make it different colors, but this is the easiest in terms of adjusting it down the line and changing the colors to whatever you want, but this will help get the look. And then I'm just gonna hold shift while I click and drag to create a perfect square. And once that's done, we can line it up with the align tool over here. If I click on it and hit V and then hit the fill and hit enter, it'll bring up these little 2 dots that will let me adjust the gradient. And I'm just going to do it from top to bottom, and you can hold shift to make sure they go straight down. We can rename this by hitting enter and then typing in 1. Then we will duplicate it until we have 6 layers, because a cube has 6 layers. And then select all of them and enable 3D over here, and then make sure that you are using a classic 3D renderer. If you don't see this little tab over here, you can always hit Command K, go into 3D renderer, and then select classic 3D. Now this first one we can just leave as is, and we'll hide everything else but the second one, and we can open 2 view mode, and then I've set this one to left just so I can see straight on, and then from the left it's going to make it a little bit easier. Now we want to move the anchor point. In this case I'm going to use an anchor point tool mover. In this case we'll use the motion tools one, and it'll let us really easily move it around, and that's going to make it a little bit easier to get all the edges lined up perfectly. So I will select it at the very bottom, and then if I hit R, it'll bring up the rotation, and then we can rotate it however we want. In this case, we will use the X rotation, and we will set that to -90. And then the third one, we can highlight that and then move it to the top this time, and then hit R, and then we will do the opposite and set that to 90, and that'll give us then a top and a bottom and a front facing pane. Now for the next one, open that up and then set it to the right. And this time we will be using the Y rotation, and we will set that to 90. And then on the 5th one, if you hit R again, you can and move over the anchor point to the left and set that to, again, the opposite of what we just did, so -90. Last thing we have to do is take the back pane, which is going to be our back panel, and just move it to the back. And if you're in doubt how far to put it back, you can open one of them or click on one of them and then type in size, and then see, okay, what's the size of each of these ones. That'll make it a little bit easier. So you know you have to move it back to 284, whatever. So it's a bit easier if you work with round numbers, but it'll work for now. You can open up the position and paste that in there, and that'll move it to the back. Now we can close the 2 view mode, and then if we go into layer, new, and create a null object and make sure that that is also set to 3D, we can select all our layers and parent them to the null object. We can rename this to controller or box controller. Then we will hit A to bring up the anchor point, and you can go into 2 view mode, and you can also hit Y if you want, and then we'll drag this back to be in the middle of our shape. So just hold shift and drag until you are pretty much in the middle. Again, if you're working with round numbers, it's going to be a lot easier to get it exact. So I definitely recommend that for a more perfect result. Now we can go back to 1 view mode, and if we hit R on the controller, now we can rotate our box however we like. And you can see we've got this nice little gradient, looks pretty cool, and we'll just undo that so we get back to 0. Next, we can take all of these box layers and change the blending mode to exclusion, and that'll just change the look just a little bit. It'll kind of mix with the black and the white values and get some really interesting looking things, and this will work really well with how we're going to color it in just a second. We can take all of these layers and just select them all, and then we're going to pre-compose them and name this box pre, and drag that into our pre-comps folder up in here. Now if we go back into the pre-comp folder, we can animate this a little bit. So if we hit P and R on the controller itself, we can go forward a little bit. Let's do 1 second and just keyframe the position and all of the rotations. In this case, let's turn this around to about 45 degrees this way, so we are right at an angle, and then tilt it down a little bit. So this will be like our base look, if that makes sense. Like this is like our ground zero. We'll go back, let's move it up a little bit and tilt it up as well, so that we have it coming down kind of like it's being ducked. And we can take these keyframes and copy it and move it forward a little bit. I'll paste them forward a little bit, And then on this one, we are gonna exaggerate it just a little bit so we get some bounce in there, overshooting. And then we'll move it down just a little bit and tilt it a little bit more to exaggerate the impact. Still looks pretty static because it is linear and pretty slow. So we can take these keyframes and move them up a little bit so we get a little bit of a faster movement. And the same with this, move that closer. We can select these keyframes, and if we hit F9, we should be able to ease them. And then if you can go into the easing curve and you can play around with how you want it to be, but then we can take these and maybe move them closer a little bit more this way so that we get just a little bit more impact as it kind of lands in and then slowly eases out. This looks pretty good. Then we'll go back into this view and then we'll just add this, slide this a little bit of rotation to rotate it around. We can just go forward and turn the Y rotation whichever way we want. Let's just do, I don't know, about that much, pretty much just about one rotation. And we'll move that all the way so it spans across our entire timeline. So now we have something that looks kind of like that. And we might even take this first one and move it so that it only starts spinning afterwards. Maybe a couple frames before it just to get a little bit of movement in there, but keep it pretty simple. Now we can go back into the main composition and I want to duplicate our box pre, and I want to make sure that I duplicate it up in my project window up here and then open it up, and that just makes it a true duplicate so I can change stuff in here without messing with the actual composition in here. And we'll rename this by hitting Command K and name this box pre, and we'll just add an outline before the pre because that is what this one will be. Then we can select all our shape layers and remove the fill. And we will add a stroke, make sure it is set to white, and let's set it to something like 2 pixels or 1 pixel. Just kind of depends on the look that you are going for. Change the blending mode to normal as well. It doesn't have to be set to exclusion. And then we will drag that into our composition, our main composition. Now you can see we have those lines overlaying a little bit. So it just gives it a little bit more of the feeling of it actually being a box, especially with the exclusion added to the original one. It kind of gets lost a little bit. Now we can start having a little bit of fun. I'm gonna start by creating a solid by hitting Command Y, and we'll just name this background. And you can make this whatever color you want, but I'm just gonna make it black and hit OK and put that in the very back, of course. And to our main box layer, I'm gonna add a colorama, which is a super cool effect. If you wanna see a more in-depth use of it, I would recommend watching Sky's video. It'll be linked up in the little info icon up in the top right. We're gonna be pretty simple. I'll just pick one of these solarized ones. Let's do a solarized green. And then I'll take this and move it to the very top so that it gets as close as possible to that black. It takes the white values, makes them green, the black values, and makes them black. And we can copy that colorama and paste it onto our outline so that they get that coloring as well. We are gonna add a curves, and we will place that before our colorama, and that'll just give us a little bit more contrast, take up the green, the whites a little bit, make them really white, and the greens just makes it look a little bit cooler. You just want to make sure you don't get any of that weird edges. If I take it down too far, you can see it looks kind of weird. So just get it to a nice point to where it looks pretty contrasty. Also, in the end, we will add a lumetri color and open up basic corrections and mess around with the contrast and the exposure. So we'll increase the contrast a little bit, increase the highlights, and decrease the shadows, which will just add a little extra contrast in there as well. Just get it look really, really stylized, which looks super cool. Then to our outline layer, we are gonna add a deep glow, which is a paid plugin, but super cool. Maybe up the exposure to like something like 1.5 to really get some nice oomph in there, and set the radius to 700. And you can even go into the box layer, select all your layers, and set the stroke to maybe 1 if you want to change the look and have it not be as thick, I suppose. Now we'll add some pretty cool sparkly stars. We'll go into our shape layer and click and hold, and then select the star tool, and then shift drag it up until you get a star. Remove the stroke from it, and then set the fill to a nice white color. And then if you go into the settings, into the polystar path, and then change it to 4 points, that'll give us the base of our little cool looking sparkle looking thing. Increase the outer radius to give it some nice points, decrease the inner radius, and just play around with it until you get it to be a size you think looks pretty cool. And then increase the inner radius just a little bit, which will give it that nice pointy look. Place it right in the middle, so just use the align tool, place it right in the middle, make sure that your anchor point is in the center as well. And then hit S to bring up the scale, and let's go to about 6 frames. So right where we are here, keyframe that, go to the beginning, set it to 0, and then go to 12 frames and set it to 0 again. We can click the scale to select all the keyframes, go to flow. Again, you can get these presets on the Patreon and apply sexy speed, and just like that, we have a nice little sparkle animation super quick, but that's kind of how we want it. Next up is finding some spots where we want to place this animation. So let's say right about here, we want the first sparkle to come in. So let's put it right here, go to where it's the biggest and place it on the corner you want to. So let's say right here, then hit P and shift U to bring up the other keyframes we have as well. Keyframe the position and go to the beginning. And if you click on your layer, you can see this little dot, which is where the center of it is. And we're just gonna follow this corner through all three. And this is just a little bit of manual labor, but it just makes sure that it follows it along. Just makes it look a little bit nicer when it actually follows the corner of it. Then you can duplicate and do this however many times you want. Stylize it a little bit more by adding deep glow. So add that using FX Console. Go in, increase the exposure to something like 1.5 to get a really, really nice, hefty glow in there. And for this one, we'll open up the chromatic aberration and enable that. And that'll just give us a little bit of separation in there if we enable it and then increase it just a little bit. You can change the color to something like red and green if you want to. I think red and blue looks pretty cool. Just gives it a little bit more of a stylized look. And you can just copy that deep glow and paste it onto all the other sparkles that you have in there. So far looks pretty cool. Just a nice couple of sparkles and a box rotating. However, we do need a bit of context because right now it just comes in. I guess it's pretty cool as is, but it would just be a little bit cooler if we add some context to the box kind of dropping down in a sense. We are going to hit Command N to create a new composition and name this Stair Jump Pre, I suppose. You can name it whatever you want. It's really not important. And I'll turn off transparency just because it's going to be a little bit easier. Again, go into a shape tool. This time we'll select a rectangle and we'll just draw out little platforms like this. Just make them real skinny and you can just duplicate and position them wherever you want, kind of like this. So that looks pretty good. And again, we'll go into the shape layer again and do an ellipse, hold shift and drag. That'll create a little ball. Now we will want to make sure that we move the anchor point down to the bottom. That's going to make it a little bit easier for us to add a little bit of squash and stretch to it, really add to that realism of the ball. Next step is to hit P on your ball and keyframe the position. Let's go and zoom in a little bit. Let's go 12 frames and move that keyframe over. Now that we have it down here, we can go back a little bit. Let's drag it up somewhere up high where it kind of looks realistic. Go forward another 12 frames. And then we will drag it up again and kind of create a little bit of movement, make it look like it's bouncing, and then we will adjust the curves of our path and the easing afterwards. But we just want to get the general feel down for a bounce, kind of keep it as realistic as we kind of can. And right there and forward and off the screen. Now we can adjust these curves to make it look a little bit more realistic. So let's click on it and then we can use these, control where we want it to go, and we want to have it come down pretty sharp but still move a little bit towards the side that it's going to be going, but we don't want it to be too flat because otherwise it's going to look like it's sliding across, which we don't want. So now if we play that back, we have a bounce that looks kind of like that. So pretty simple. And if we hit Shift S, we can bring up the scale. That'll just allow us to get a little bit of that squash and stretch. So if we go a little bit before it comes down, we'll unlink this, keyframe the scale, and as it lands, we will decrease this last numerical value to squish it down a little bit, and then as it comes up, we'll take it back to 100 and go forward all the way until it comes all the way over here, and then we will keyframe it again, and we can take these keyframes and we can paste it and just line up the center with where it lands, because that'll be where it wants to squish. And that's why we moved the anchor point down to where it is, just so it's easier so we don't scale from the middle, which will just mess around with our ground contact just a little bit. You can even, in between these, you can add a little bit of a squash as well, so that we get something that looks kind of like it's flowing in the motion. And then if we go to transform and then auto orient along path, hit OK, we just get a little bit of a nicer movement. Instead of it being like a flat circle towards the top, it'll just look a little bit nicer as it animates in and kind of follow the shape of the path that it's taken. So if we play that back, you can see we get a little bit of a nicer motion there. Now we will take all the keyframes, just select all of them and then hit F9 to add some easing to them. And already we get a little bit of a nicer movement. Let's start with the position keyframes by clicking the position and then go into our graph editor. For this first one, we'll drag it kind of towards the center a little bit. Just keep it pretty simple as it comes in. Gets a little bit of impact. For the second one, we'll drag it towards the left a little bit. So as it lands, it kind of carries a little bit of that momentum into the second bounce. And if we lift this off the ground just a little bit it will just keep the motion a little bit smoother rather than coming to a complete still stand. We get a little bit of that springiness. And again, we want to do that same thing with her, and we'll take it and drag it towards the right and lift it off the ground a little bit so that it doesn't come to a complete stop. It just kind of launches, and we get just a little bit of that still stand as it reaches the very top, kind of like a roller coaster that goes up, and then as it goes down, it picks up the speed and gets some of that impact. And we'll take this and move it in towards this way, kind of like that, and lift it off the ground, both of these points, and we'll just continue that same pattern pretty much. Now we have this little nice ball bouncing animation with just a little bit of squash and stretch. We can add a little bit more movement to this. Let's take the shape layers, hit S to bring up the scale and unlink all of them. We want to keyframe all of these, so hit the keyframe at 100% and then go back to the beginning, and let's change the first number to 0 on all 3 of them, and then select them and then use 60 speed so that it just animate out a little bit as they come in, just a slight bit of animation, and we can even stagger them just a little bit so that one comes in right before it kind of falls on it. So animates in, boom, second one, animate that one in, and the third one, and that is the opposite way. So move that forward over this way. So we have that one comes in right before it animates, second one, and the last one, move that forward just a little bit more, and just adds a little bit more visual interest to it. You can even add a position animation by hitting P, keyframing that, and go back a little bit and just move them down, all 3 of them, select them, add some 60 speed, and move these keyframes to the beginning of the layers so that the movement kind of matches. So they kind of come up, boom, boom, and boom, and as it animates off, we'll just leave it at that. That is all we need to do for the first one, and we can go into our project and take the stair jump pre and add it in here, and we'll add it above everything else. And now if we hit U, we can show this little animation, boom, 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 and then right here is where we want to cut. So I'll hit Shift Command D on the staircase jump layer, and I'll take all our other layers and move them forward so that they come in right as that comes in, boom. So now we're going to have to match cut between these two and create a little bit of a smooth transition. So we will take another ball, and we'll just hit the shake tool, hold Shift and click and drag and create a ball, and make sure that the anchor point is right in the middle, and we can center this up as well, and then hit P to bring up the position, and we'll move this below the stair jump case, and we'll go to where the impact happens of our staircase, so right here, and we will position this where we want it, so maybe like right here, keyframe the position, then you want to go back to where the staircase kind of ends, and you can take this and you can just drag it to wherever you want to be, take it out of frame a little bit, move it up, get some nice movement in there, and then go forward just a little bit and move that out the frame. So essentially another jump animation. Again, adjust these curves so that we don't get a sliding animation, because that's not what we're going for. Take this one, make it like a steep coming down and that a steep coming up. It's like keyframes, add some easing to it by hitting F9, go into your easing, and then you can play around with the easing so that you want it to come in pretty fast and leave pretty fast like that. So it comes in, boom, boom, lift that up just a little bit, go back into this, and then we want it to land right there. And this is all just about playing with the timing of the keyframes to get something that looks pretty accurate. Maybe drag these in a little bit. We don't need them to be that slow like that, so we get some with a little bit of impact, and we want it to hit, let's say, right about there. So move that right there, and boom, that looks pretty good, I think. And let's just end it right here by hitting N. Now we can go into this layer and we'll add some deep glow to it. We can copy the deep glow from our little sparkles. So go into that, go into the effects, copy that deep glow, paste it onto these layers. Let's add it to the ball and all 3 of these. And we might even change the color of these. Let's add a little bit of a fill. So we'll make this first one a bit of a darker green, and let's do the second one like a medium green, and maybe the last one we'll do a bright green. And then we can select all these layers and type in exposure, and for the first one I want to set it to like 0.5, the second one to 1, and the last one to 1.5, just to give it a little bit of visual difference in terms of what it is, give it some hierarchy. And we want to paste that deep glow onto the ball as well, so it has that. Boom. So now we have this nice little sequence here, which is pretty much the main part of the animation. There's not much more to it. We're just going to add just a little bit of spice to it as per usual. You know, I can't help myself. We're going to start off by adding an adjustment layer, and we're going to add posterized time to it. Of course, set that to 12. Hit Shift Command Y to go into the settings and rename this to posterized time, so we always know what it is. Then we are going to add a solid by hitting Command Y and naming this grain. Change the color to 80/80/80 and add grain to it, the effect to add grain itself. Change it to something like Codec Vision 200T, go into final output, increase the size to something like 1.5, softness to something like 1.2, and add a tint to make it actually black and white, because it's not going to actually be black and white if you just click the monochromatic. It's going to be like a purple, gray, green thing. Pre-compose this and move all attributes into a new composition and name this grain pre. Make sure your project is in order, so drag that into the pre-comps folder and change the blending mode to something like overlay to get a nice bit of grain in there. You can already see how nice that looks on top of with the glow added in there as well. It just looks super, super clean. Background, we can add a gradient. So add a gradient ramp, set it to radial, swap colors, set the middle to 540 in this case because I'm working with a 1080 composition. Depends on how big your composition is. Let's change this to a dark green color like that and move this up just so we get a little bit of that green in there. Just makes it look a little bit cooler in my opinion. It just gives it a little bit of extra edge. Let's hide both of these for now, and we're just going to add a slight little match cut type thing. So if you go into your staircase jump and hit P to open the position, keyframe that and move forward a little bit and then slide it out to the left. And in this case, you want to make sure you have continuously rasterize or whatever this thing is called, just so it doesn't get that hard edge right there. And move these keyframes a little bit apart, select them, add some sexy speed to them, and move them to be right in the middle of where this layer ends. So now if you play that back, you get a little bit of movement coming in that way. Boom. Maybe drag it out a little bit more and make it a little bit more aggressive. So just move these back this way, go back and drag it that way a little bit more. Line it up here and select your cube layers, hit P, and then keyframe the position. Move these forward just a little bit and then drag them out to the right. And then we will line up the keyframes with these keyframes. So take these, move them right there, select them, add some sexy speed as well to match the easing of them. And now if we play that back, we should have a nice little match cut coming in. Boom. And that just helps sell the transition just a little bit by giving it just that tiny bit of extra movement. Add another solid and we will name this particles. Doesn't matter what color it is, but we will add a fractal noise and we will increase the contrast a whole bunch and then open up the brightness and you can drag that down as much as you want until you just get tiny little specks. You can play around with the complexity, increase that to something like 7 and go into transform. You can scale that down a little bit to get a little bit, a little bit smaller and just play around with these settings until you get a result you think looks pretty nice. Just a few couple of specs. Go into the evolution options and in the random seed, you want to alt click it and then add a posterized time. Let's set it to 3 and then a random, put whatever number you want in there. Just make sure it is big, something like 5,000 will work plenty fine. Now, if you play that back, we get a nice little animated overlay type thing and we'll just change the blending mode to add and drag both the green and the particles below the posterized time. And you can add another adjustment layer between the particles and the posterized time, add a transform to it, and then set the scale to something like 101 and alt click the position, posterized time 12, and then set it like a wiggle 222, and that just gives it a little bit of camera shake. And the reason that we add a little bit of scale to it is so that we don't get edges that bleed over like right there. So if you set it to 101, that gets rid of that. We can finally take it into DaVinci Resolve, which is where we are going to be doing the sound designing. You don't need the paid version of DaVinci Resolve, anything. You just download for free. You can do it in Premiere, wherever you want. I just don't like sound designing in After Effects because it's just a little bit more laggy because it takes longer to animate the previews and all that stuff. And also just a bit harder to work with the audio tools and all that stuff. So as far as sound design goes, there's a couple things I like to keep in mind that I reuse across pretty much everything I do. It's kind of like my fundamentals of how I choose to sound design things. I like really full, deep, airy sounds. I just think it works a lot better for a lot of things, just gives us a little bit more depth, and also usually works better with like talking tracks because those sound frequencies lie in a different level than talking sounds. So it usually works better in combination if you're working with that. Layering is also super important just because it adds that depth that you might not be able to get if you just use one sound effect here, one sound effect there. I'm sure that if you've played around with sound designing, you know how big of a difference that can make. I usually like to start out with the small details like the little sparkles and little bounces, little jumps, hits, all that stuff. From there, I'll go to more overall movements like big swooshes, airy sounds, impact sounds. And last, I choose to do atmosphere, just because like if you are living in just everyday life, there's always some sounds. You're never just, unless you're deaf, but there's always some kind of sound, which is also important to have in your animations. If you have moments where there's no sound at all, it just feels super dead and silent almost, you can get your sound effects from whatever you want. It doesn't matter as long as you find some good ones that kind of fit. So let's start with the sparkles here, because those will probably be the easiest. And of course, you want to make sure you have some professional headphones like the Apple AirBuds. They are my go-to because it's super professional and the sound quality is super nice. So very simple, I'm just going to search for a sparkle sound. It really doesn't matter what the sound is, you just want it to make sense. It can be a long process, but it's something that has such a big impact on your animations that it's definitely worth taking the time finding some really good ones. And the good thing about it is you can always reuse them later. So once you find a really good sound, you're kind of good to go. Place it kind of wherever you want. And this is, again, you kind of want to see where you think it fits. Sometimes it doesn't go right where the marker is. Sometimes it starts a little bit off. So you just want to play around with it until you find a position that sounds like it makes sense. That's why I like using wired headphones, just because it makes it a lot easier so there's no latency. And one thing I do like to do a lot is just playing with the volume and mixing it a little bit, and then also the semitones and the sense to change the sound ever so slightly. So maybe in this case, I wanted it a little bit lighter, so I'll increase the semitones, and that'll make it sound a little bit more dainty. And then we'll just duplicate this sound because it works very well, and we'll move it over here where this one comes in, and the last one coming in right here. And I just alt click and drag to move them around and duplicate them. It's the easiest. Now we can start with the bounce hit, and for this one, I'm just gonna do a bit of I'm just gonna search for ball hit. Should work pretty well. They have a lot of good ones. Again, as I said, I really like deep, airy sounds, like this one works, and then we're just gonna match it up with when it hits. So right there, you can always unselect the snapping. Sometimes that makes it a little bit easier getting it right on there. So in this case, you can see it's kind of in between, but put it right there. Makes it a lot easier without the snapping on there. And in this case, I want to take the volume down just a little bit and change the semitones a little bit, make it a little bit of a deeper sound that I just feel like it sounds more like it fits. And again, alt click and drag it to duplicate the layer. And we of course want one for this one as well, but this one I want to make it a little bit more impactful since we have a new element in there. So for this case, I'm just going to search for a deep impact. I think this one might be pretty good, so we will download that. Right here is where I want the sound to kind of hit, I think. Decrease the volume a little bit, and you can even layer it. As I said, layering is usually pretty good by alt clicking and adding that sound right as, let's add that right there. Let's find a nice swoosh sound. I like this one. This one is pretty airy, not too cartoony in the sound of it, which I really like. We'll add that in there, place that in, and we can change the speed of it a little bit, so slow it down ever so slightly, not that much. And let's line it up with where this kind of falls down a little bit less in the semitones, just deepen it up. That sounds pretty good. Just adds a little bit of depth in there. Now let's find a little bit of like a digital glitchy noise for these three balls, because they kind of remind me of like a neon light type thing. So let's do maybe a lightsaber kind of coming out. That could kind of be a good sound for it maybe. Let's go back into Davinci and add that sound in there, drag that in, zoom in a little bit, and move it up, and right as it starts coming in right about here, and decrease the volume a good bit. Oh yeah, that is sweet. Maybe take the semitones down a little bit. Oh yeah, that's awesome. Drag that in, that starts right here. Layer that, and another one. Now all we need is a little bit of atmosphere, and I think like a space atmosphere could be pretty cool. Something kind of, kind of looks a bit spacey. That's so sweet. Just spacey, ethereal, a little bit kind of scary. Matches perfectly with the dark kind of theme, and then with the glows that we have in there as well. Just gives it just a little bit of that life. And let's turn that back on. We can start it right at the start. Boom. Now the last thing we want to do is just add a little bit of a swoosh right where it goes to that scene right there. So we will have to find another airy whoosh, swoosh, something. I think that'll work pretty good actually. I'm getting lucky today. Usually it takes me quite a while to find some good ones, but I guess You know, once you've done it for a little while, you kind of get pretty good. Let's drag that underneath at the very bottom, and we'll have that start right here. Let's drag that to match. Decrease the volume a little bit, semitones down a little bit, make it a little bit deeper, a little bit less, reset the semitones. It's this one that I want to decrease, and we will increase the volume of this one. Oh yeah. And that is pretty much all there is to sound designing and a little bit of animation. We've made the animation, which again, you can get on Patreon if you are a patron over there. So head over there, link in the description, or patreon.com/Mapal. With that said, I just want to say thank you for following along. Hopefully you learned something new. Hopefully you want to try this out. If you do your own sound designing, I'd love for you to send it to me so we can see. And yeah, I'll see you again next week. Peace out.